presentation by Karen Fox of the Wildwood Historical Society on one-room schoolhouses in Wildwood. And I just read your book over the last, well, it's been a few months now, but it was a great book and a really easy read. And on bike rides all the time, I know a lot of the schoolhouses to look for, and one's on Melrose that I always ride by. So it's just raised my awareness more, and I think that's what a lot of people will get out of the book and out of your talk tonight. So,
thank you.
It's all yours.
Oh, okay. So first of all, thank you for having me. This has been such a joy to work on. The book was published in 2016, and I go out and I speak a lot to different groups, but we've got a lot to cover, so I'm going to just jump in. I'm going to share my screen. And how does that look to everybody? Good?
Good. Looks good.
Okay. So I saw the agenda tonight. I know you have a lot to cover, so I'm going to try to be somewhat quick. I've planned about 30 to 40 minutes, and then there'll be time for Q&A. And just a reminder, if you do have questions, I'll take them at the end. And if you don't want to forget them, maybe jot down a note, or you can add in the chat feature at the bottom. You could just go ahead and shoot out your question, and we'll take those at the end. So when you talk about early education and one-room schoolhouses in the area that is now Wildwood, it's really important to understand where the first villages were. So I'm going to start with the oldest one that we're aware of, and St. Andre was situated in what is now northern Wildwood. It was established in 1798 by the Spanish government, so this was Spanish territory at the time. And most of the people that moved here were American veterans. They had served in the Revolutionary War. A lot came here. They came to this part of the country because they wanted free land and they wanted no taxes. So you can see right there, that's a current municipality map. It gives you the general feeling of where it was. There were about 400 people living here from the very beginning. And these were mostly Protestant families coming from the Upper South and Pennsylvania that settled here. So this is a map. We have it in the museum. It's from 1797, and it shows all of the people that settled here during that really first migration of Americans. These are almost exclusively all Americans. The village of St. Andre is shown there where the red star is. This map was drawn in 1797 by James McKay, who was the commandant. The reason I'm going into all of this is we do have a lot of information about how education functioned, and this is prior to the Louisiana Purchase. A lot of these Americans were sending their children to boarding school. And we can look at the data on Lawrence Long. His original land grant is in Chesterfield, but his descendants really came down into what is now Wildwood. So we can see Lawrence Long Estate in 1805 is paying for the boarding of 2 children. And we don't really know where that is, but we do know that he's paying boarding for each child. It's about $2 a month. We have more data on his son, Gabriel Long, and Gabriel took over the mill. There was a mill, it's situated in Chesterfield, but they also had a distillery and a salt plant and a tannery. So this was a really big operation. And his children are being sent to boarding school in Florissant. And we know that it's probably a Catholic school, and the Longs were probably not Catholic, but that was the best option that they had at the time. So who lived here? I'm talking about these are Americans, but they're about 400 in 1799. A quarter of them are enslaved. Then by 1850, you have a lot of things that have happened. There's been a huge wave of a migration of Americans coming into the Louisiana Purchase. And then you also have a lot of Germans that are immigrating, and they come in large numbers in the 1830s and 1840s. And then following the Civil War, you still have a large African-American population living in the area. And then it drops down from 1910 and continuing after that. And a lot of this is caused by the Great Migration of African-Americans moving from rural areas into more, moving into cities where they have more opportunity for education and also for work. The reason I bring all this up is because it affected where the schoolhouses would be and what type of schoolhouses there would be in the area that is now Wildwood. So the question is, how is this education funded? Because the property tax system that we have in place now, that didn't come along until after the Civil War. So the question is, how did they fund all of the schools that they were going to be building? This is a map you're looking at from 1838, and it's Wildwood. It's really the southern part of Wildwood. The red circle there is not where the school is, it's just the land that is going to support the school expenses. You see Fox Creek is in the lower left corner. The upper right corner of this map from 1838 is really the pond in the Grover area. So you can see that a lot of the land has not been sold yet. But there's a plan in place, and this was set up by Thomas Jefferson in the land ordinances. It was meant for the expansion and the growth in the United States, that there was going to be a plan on how schools would be funded. And they would be funded by the revenue from that specific section. It's always called Section 16 within a township district. So this is 36 sections, and this was considered a township, and the funds received from either the rent, the lease, or even the sale of that section of land would fund all of the schools in that area. So this is a map that it's in the book, but we also have it kind of in a larger scale in the museum. But it shows you where all of the schools were located, and it represents 150 years. So the map in the background you're seeing is Merrimack Township, which is really the kind of the original name for this area. People would say they were from Merrimack Township, and it was also kind of a legal description too, as far as where they paid their taxes and whatnot. But there were over 28 schools throughout this 100+ year period. On the map, you can kind of see we've highlighted the black schoolhouses, and they're an example of schools that didn't come along until after the Civil War. So this is a map that's in the collection, and it's really a great resource because it is a blueprint of the school district boundaries in 1919. On the upper left, you can see the entire St. Louis County. There were about 150 one-room schoolhouses in the county. And at that time, the entire county was extremely rural. I've zoomed in here. This is the westernmost part of St. Louis County. Most of this is now in Wildwood. At the time, it was called Merrimack Township. And you can see each school is called a district. Even though it was just one little structure and there were, dozens of children attending, but they called them districts. So I want to feature the Bonham Schoolhouse. It's situated in Chesterfield in the Bottoms, now, the big shopping area that you're all familiar with. And even though it's not in technically Wildwood, it's very close to the boundary. Many of the children that attended here would have lived in what is now northern Wildwood. And the Bonham Schoolhouse was located on a road that led to the ferry, which was really the only way to get across the river in this part of northern Wildwood. And the ferry was called the Lewis Ferry, and then it's changed to the Howell Ferry. But what this picture represents is one of the oldest schools in our area. And you can see this, it was photographed in 1880, and it's very crowded. There are a lot of families standing out front. The school closed in 1952, and an interesting little tidbit about the school is it became a tavern shortly after that. So, and it was a very popular tavern. Many people that lived in what is now northern Wildwood went to this tavern. And then during the Great Flood of 1993, the structure was really kind of destroyed and it had to eventually be demolished. But when you're talking about the oldest school that we know of, the oldest schoolhouse that existed in what now is Wildwood, it is the Bacon Schoolhouse. And it's situated near the historic village of Kelp. You can see this is a current map for the city of Wildwood, and I've circled it on there. The physical site is described, so we know the general location of it, although we haven't found any remnants of it. It was donated by the Bacon family. They were a very large family. There were 4 brothers that came here from Virginia prior to the Louisiana Purchase, and they settled throughout Wildwood. They were very strong supporters of education, and this schoolhouse dates to about the 1820s. We know it continued in place for a very long time. The Bacon family members actually sold property to the Kelp family, and then the Kelp community becomes established. What's unique and interesting about this family is that they were neighbors of Thomas Jefferson, and they came here before the Louisiana Purchase. So you can kind of imagine that they were writing back saying how great this area is. Go ahead and buy it. On the very bottom, we actually have a receipt for tuition paid to the school. It's dated 1831. And the person who received the money for payment is someone by the name of F. Hancock. And the Hancock family owned the land where the stone church is. You might be familiar with the very old Rock Bethel church. So this represents the oldest school that we know of in the area. The Wild Horse School takes its place. We don't know if it's on the same foundation, but it's in the same general area, and it's described very similarly. And we start seeing reference to this in the 1860s through these photographs. So this school was around for a long time, probably almost 100 years. And if you didn't see on the map earlier, it's where I've circled the red circle there. So it's on the western side of Babler Park. The foundation actually sits in Babler Park. The school is no longer standing. This shows where the Wild Horse School was on a map. This was a well-traveled route that connected the southern part of the county to the ferry up by where the Boone Bridge is now. So I like to include this picture because the Dozier Schoolhouse was in Merrimack Township. It was not in Wildwood, but it really shows, it's an excellent example of an old school. It was photographed prior to 1876. It's situated about halfway between Allenton and Pacific. And what I like about this, or what is striking about this, is that it really looks rustic, and it doesn't look like a place that maybe you would think children would be running to go to every day. So it is a good example of what the earliest schoolhouses looked like. So this is the Orville School, and you might be familiar with this. This structure is still standing. It's a private residence, and it's in the community of Orville. I like to show this because it's so crowded. There are so many children. And one of the interesting things we know in studying this school is that in this photograph is about 1893. We know that in September of that year, there were 42 students in attendance, but that number explodes up to 64 by November. And that's mostly because these students were all, a lot of the older students were helping their families on the farm, and they had to work during harvest season. And so they couldn't attend the full school year. The teacher that's teaching, her name is Carrie Hillebrand, and she's about age 18 when she takes on this role. And she has to control from first grade up to 8th grade. And, you know, just imagine 64 students. She's very well known. She's the stepsister to Fred Essen. He's a very important person in the community. He supports a lot of education and a lot of schools, and he also becomes the county recorder of deeds, and he buys 2 newspapers in St. Louis. So this family was very involved in education in the area that's now Wildwood. One thing that's kind of unique about the Orville School is they added on a 2nd room, and they probably did that because it was so crowded. That was done in 1895. And in this picture, this is pretty close to how it looks today. It's a private residence off of Etherton Road. So earlier I talked about the Black schoolhouses. They started after the Civil War. And some of the history behind that is that Missouri was a slave state and it prohibited slaves from learning to read and write. After the Civil War, the Constitution was changed and they added African schools. But with the rise of Jim Crow laws, Missouri joined other southern states and they enacted legislation that actually was difficult for the African American community to receive an education. In 1889, they passed segregationist laws that said Black children could not go to white schools and white children could not go to Black schools. So that was really the beginning of a formal segregated society. And that continued until 1954 with the Brown versus Board of Education. It took about another 10 years for St. Louis County to integrate, and that happened after the Civil Rights Movement in the 60s. So to go through some of these pictures here, you might have seen some of these before, but in the upper left is the Orville Black School that was located in an area that is now called Westland Acres. This was a place where a lot of former slaves of the Long family purchased land and settled. And this first structure was a combined church and school for the community. The photo was taken around the 1890s. Below, you see a picture of the 2nd schoolhouse built in that community that was built in the 1930s, and it's a wooden structure. And then I don't have a photo, but there was a 3rd structure that was built in 1950, and that was built of kind of cinder block, and that was in operation for another 15 years. So on the right, I have a picture of one of the school teachers at the Mount Pleasant Colored School, and his name was Otis Shackelford. He taught school there in, we know, 1897. He actually goes on after this to become a well-known essayist. He becomes published and quite well known. He moves to Kansas City. He's not from the area. He came here to teach in the Mount Pleasant School. But he talks about the area. He was teaching 14 children in that school, and the term was 6 months, and he was paid $30 a month, and it was a log school. He talks about it, and it was used as both a church and a school. So it was a very similar story. But when he writes, what's unique is we have very few stories about teachers teaching and talking about teaching here. And he talks about how he was inspired when he was working here. And he actually, I have a quote there. He says, "I did my first real thinking here, and I realized for the first time the possibilities of a broader life." So it was a great experience for him. Talking about diversity, I mentioned earlier that there was a large German population in Merrimack Township, and this was not unique to Merrimack Township. St. Louis was known as with a very large German population. So some of the schools really insisted to support that German population. This is a picture of the Hollow Schoolhouse. It's located west of the village of Hollow. The structure is no longer standing. This photo was taken in the 1880s, but we know that the land was donated originally in 1869. And it was donated by someone called Henry Hankin. His farm is actually was purchased by the Wildwood Historical Society. So if you've ever been there, that was his farm. And then west of there is a little, an acre or a half acre that he donated for that schoolhouse in the area. What was important to the German community is that German be taught in the schools. And this is an example of a book that we have in our collection over at the Wildwood Historical Society, and it's from 1894. And we know that the families were speaking German in their home, but they also wanted it to be taught in school. So they wanted the reading and the writing in full immersion in the school. So the school teachers in these areas where you had the families kind of insisting that German be part of the curriculum, the school teacher would have to be fluent in German also. So that was kind of a selection process. The school needed to have a teacher that could teach in German. So earlier, I think I mentioned about 40% of the township was German, and in certain schools they were teaching it. So one thing that changed, this went on for many decades, many generations, but during World War I, there was a rise in kind of anti-German sentiment across the United States. And it really starts in 1917 when the US enters the war. The war's been going on for several years, but we enter in 1917. And President Wilson actually restricts the use of German. So a lot of things are going on in the public space. The German press is heavily censored. In St. Louis, there were German newspapers that people that lived out here read. Libraries were pulling books from the shelves, and German Americans felt targeted. So they started assimilating more. They stopped speaking German in public and in school. And some people went to the extreme of changing their last name. A lot of things were changed, names of schools, foods were changed, streets and towns. So it was a time of transition for the area. And so German that was once taught in schools kind of came to an end then. So this is Pond School. And of all the schools, I'll probably show more from this one because I think you recently visited the school. What some people don't always know is that this was the third structure. This is located on Manchester Road. It was the third schoolhouse built called Pond School. This structure right here, that's stucco, was built around 1914, and it stayed in operation until 1951. The building was restored by the city and volunteers in 2005. And you're probably wondering where the other schools were. So the very first structure we know of was located south of Pond, and on the map you can see the red circle around it. That was the first Pond School that we know of. This map dates to 1878, so it's before the other structures were built. But the school probably dates to much older. That school becomes what was called the Pond Colored School at the time, so the Pond Black School. And we know that stays in operation till at least 1905. So up the green dot, the green circle represents where the second structure was built, and that's a wooden structure. And it was situated directly in front of the stucco structure that you've probably seen. So that is built in the 1880s. We don't have an exact date. It burned down, and that's why they built the new stucco structure that you've seen. And the stucco was intentional because it was more fireproof. A lot of wooden buildings, homes, and schools, they had a problem with them burning. This is a picture of the wooden Pond School. So imagine this being the school sitting right in front of where the stucco structure is now. It was photographed here in 1910. It was built, we think, around 1887, but we're not certain. And it was renovated in 1895. So sometime after this picture was taken, it burned to the ground. Again, in the Pond School, it was required that both German and English were taught. And that was throughout most of its existence. Another interesting fact about this school is a lot of schools were used for other kind of meeting places. And this one, in 1899, the Pond Literary Society met here every Tuesday night. So I thought that was interesting. That was actually something new I discovered since the book was published. So this is an exterior shot in 1920 of the Pond School. And a couple of comments, you can't see it in the background, but there were two outhouses. There was one for boys and one for girls. And that was considered pretty nice because usually there was only one outhouse. And another thing I noticed when I look at this picture is that it really, the current schoolhouse looks in the same shape. You know, it's really has been restored very well and it looks great. So this is the exterior. So very similar. And the stucco walls, the tile roof would have all been, you know, very good for fire prevention. This is the stone wall that sits outside of the Pond School, and you might be already aware, but in case you're not, it was built in the 1930s by the Works Progress Administration. It was part of FDR's New Deal program in response to the Great Depression. There was a lot of work done in the area that is now Wildwood, especially in Babler Park. So Pond School was like schools are now. It was the center of activities. There was a parade at least once a year that went from the school to the more social area of Grover, where there was a grove and a place for gathering, for refreshments, and for having picnics. So that was very common. This photo actually dates from 1943, so it would have been in the middle of the war, World War II. And then things like May Day parade, May Day festivities, that was really big with a lot of these schools. And graduations. At graduations, people often, especially the 8th graders that were graduating, because very few people at that time went to high school. So it was a very big celebration in the community. So now I'm going to go out a little bit and show you what was going on around Pond. So there were a lot of schools in what is now Wildwood, but I'm just going to show some of these and show how things changed and shifted over time. So the red circle you see there is the location of the Pond School, both the wooden structure and the stucco structure. And you can clearly see on the map, this map is a 1909 map. You can see the village of Pond and the village of Grover. These are all very close to where the Wildwood Town Center is now. And then in the blue circle, just below Pond, you can see that's the location of the first Pond School, and then eventually the Pond Black School. And then below that, getting closer to the railroad there, kind of connecting with Glencoe, you can see in purple, that is the location of the Glencoe Black School. And that school was established in 1886. The local residents had to fight for it. They had to go to court to get it established. And we know that the Pond School is not shown, the Pond Black School is not shown on this 1909 map. So sometime between 1905 and 1909, probably the Pond Black School had to close for some reason, maybe low enrollment, and the local Black school shifted over to Glencoe. So at the bottom of the map, you see Glencoe, you see encircled the Glencoe, it would have been the white school. And that's also, multiple structures were there. The school that is, I'm sorry, the building that is still there now, it's a private residence, is probably the second structure. So I don't know if you can all see, but behind, because depending on how your screen is, but over on the right, you should be able to see another circle, and that would be the Sappington School. And that is one of the very early schoolhouses also. And after the Civil War, the Sappingtons were Southern. After the Civil War, it gets renamed to the Ruey School. And Ruey was a judge. She actually lived near there. So that school was nearby. And then kind of up north a little, the green circle you see east of Grover, that was St. Joseph's School. But an interesting story there, it started out as St. Malachy's. It was Catholic, but most of the people in the early days were Irish. This is before the Germans came in. And so they changed the name to St. Joseph's when the saying is when the Germans overtook the Irish. That school location, they moved farther east eventually, but to orient yourself, it's where the Wildwood Schnooks is now. So that's where that school was located. So one of the things, probably one of the saddest things when I was researching the history of the schoolhouses and the people that attended was the public health issues of how highly contagious diseases were in these tight, small schools. And there were a lot of challenges there were outbreaks of measles, scarlet fever, and diphtheria. And diphtheria was very deadly. Now, there were no vaccines and there was no antibiotics. So it was a really hard period of time for children attending school. And I have two examples up here and I'll just summarize them, but one is from December in 1886. And a father has, the newspaper's reporting, his father has lost 2 children this week, and that makes 5 deaths in his family in the past 2 weeks. There are also other deaths that have occurred in the neighborhood, and this is the Hollow area. And so they've closed the school. And you hear about this a lot in the wintertime. They're closing the schools all the time because they're having outbreaks of scarlet fever and diphtheria. And then there's this other article from January in 1885 about another family where the father has lost 6 children in 5 days. He's lost all of his children in 5 days from diphtheria. So it's a very tragic time for these families. And then of course there were other things. There was cholera. There was a huge outbreak in 1849. Malaria is a constant problem until that gets cleared up, and then the flu. So I'm sure we're all aware, because of everything that's going on, the Spanish pandemic was, the biggest at the time. It lasted longer than a year. And in the end, it killed about 675,000 Americans at a time when the United States population was 1/3 of what it is now. St. Louis got a lighter case than some other cities. The city and county reported, I think, around 3,000 deaths. Most of these occurred in the last 4 months of 1918. So the deaths were actually probably higher. And most of the schools were closed for an extended period of time, from pretty much October of that fall until January. And a lot of schools would open and close and open and close. So this would go on a lot. This was very common during this time. So this is nearing the end of my presentation. I just have a couple more things, but I have this photo from Melrose School. It's on Melrose Road near the village, and it's from 1931. But the teacher on the right, her name is Mrs. Nellie Drawley. And an interesting story about her is she lived in Maplewood or Webster Groves. And she had family. Her maiden name was Connell, and she had family out here. And she taught in several different schools, but she was teaching in Melrose in 1931 and a few years after that. But in 1940, she's teaching over in the Sulphur Springs School, which is off of Manchester. And she complains to the school board that the conditions in the school are not adequate, that they need to improve them. A lot of this, it's a one-room schoolhouse down the road on Manchester. And she gets fired. So I like to include her story because I really respect, you know, she was fighting for her kids and for her local school. She ends up okay. She has a good story, but this is a picture of the interior of Melrose School. It's one of the few interior pictures we have. We have a lot of exterior pictures of the class posing in front of the school, but we have very few showing what it was like inside. So I always like to end on this slide because it's unique. That's Mrs. Nellie Drawley there on the left, the school teacher. She's in her 40s, and this is 1934. And you can just immediately see how crowded it is. Children are sharing desks. You know, the older children tended to sit toward the back, but you can really see the challenges that both the students and teachers would have had. And also you can see, you know, when I spoke earlier of some of the challenges they had with health, that it was a really big problem because inside the school, they were probably sharing a bucket of water. That was their water fountain. In later times, people would bring their own cup, but early on, they were sharing the same ladle out of that bucket that came from a well or a nearby creek. So you can really see a lot of the challenges that people had. So that is it. Any questions?
No,
Oh.
great presentation, Karen. Really appreciate that. That was very informative and reinforced my reading. So,
Okay. Well, I hope there were some new things that maybe you hadn't heard of or in the book. I tend to add things as I find, as I just tend to add things. So.
Okay. I've got a couple questions. I'm just wondering. I'm not sure when the Rockwood School District or a school district out here started. I know I went through the Kirkwood Schools, and the Kirkwood Schools integrated in '56. And I'm not sure when the schools were integrated in this area, and where did the Black African-American children go? Were they still going to these one-room schoolhouses until that time?
Okay, so I'll try to answer the first question first about when did Rockwood. I might have it in the book. I have to tell you, I can't think of it off the top of my head, but it's in the 1950s is when they started consolidating schools, and this was a long process. It was really a 20 to 30 year process that the state board of education or the state of Missouri did not like. They felt that rural schools were not offering as good of a program as you received in, you know, in cities. So there was a big push to consolidate, and the reason these one-room schoolhouses faded away is because families wanted the best education they could get, and they felt one teacher teaching 1st through 8th grade wasn't going to do it. So I would say it was sometime in the 1950s, to answer your question about Rockwood. And then the second question is, when did schools become integrated? And out here, and I would say this is probably St. Louis County in general, it didn't happen until after the Civil Rights Movement. So even though you have Brown versus Board in 1954, it doesn't happen until about 1963, 64. So those children continued going to one-room schoolhouse, African-American one-room schoolhouses out here in our community. And then in 64, they're integrated in, and two of the big schools that took Black students were Pond and Chesterfield.
That's interesting. That's fairly late. Well, at least for me it was, because that's when I was in school. So,
Teresa?
Miss Fox, I got to tell you, this has been very, very interesting. And I thank you so much for coming in and talking to us about this. I'm 62, and I went to a one-room schoolhouse in between Rolla and St. James in Phelps County, and we didn't consolidate until 1972. So I have something very close to this presentation that you have been telling us about. And my question is, are there other people, do you know if any people still live in this area that went to some of these schools that are still living?
Yes, we take a lot of oral history at the museum, at the Wildwood Historical Society. And a lot of this information, we have a lot of oral history, and then through the book and other projects that we do, we try to back it up with primary source documents, you know, a photograph or a legal document of some kind. But no, we have a lot of stories of people that attended, definitely. We have their oral history. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
One more question. These schools would go up to 8th grade. What if someone wanted higher education to go to high school and to college? What did they do? Where would they go after they graduated from the 8th grade here?
So in many cases, and I actually did oral history with some people, and they explained to me there was a lot of pressure to help on the farm. So after 8th grade, for a majority of the people that lived in this area, they were helping their families in the farming community. Now, the Eureka High School is the first high school out here in this area. And, you know, that's not established till the early 1900s. And also, if you're going to attend, there was no transportation in the beginning, you would have to get yourself there. And that was almost impossible for a lot of people. So not as many people attended high school. Some families would send their children to boarding school, or they'd send them into the city, but there weren't a lot of options. And that was something the state of Missouri really worked on. They worked on that. Their goal was to add more high schools. And you see that in our local community. You see, you know, Lafayette starts, and then a bunch of other schools are created through the Rockwood system.
No, that makes, I mean, it was a definite, you had to be very interested in further education at that time. And it, for many people, it wasn't necessary unless you wanted to be a teacher or a doctor or
the early school teachers, they went to a very short program. It's a matter of weeks, months. But, you know, I gave that example at the Orville School. You had Carrie Hillebrand at 18 is teaching every subject, you know, grades 1 through 8, and she's handling those kids. So it's, you know, it was very different.
Miss Fox, this is Elizabeth Broyles. I'm so grateful for your presentation.
Thank you.
I grew up in a small farming community in Northwest Missouri. I call it Missouri. And when I grew up in the 40s and 50s, there were schools out in the country. I think they went to 8th grade before they came into town to go to high school. And so I'm very familiar with that time frame. I was very young at the time, but also I know stories that my grandparents and my grandfather, Broyles, taught in one of those schools in the community in Mercer County, which is right on the Iowa line. And so it brings back those conversations that I had with my grandparents about them sending their children, my father and his brothers, to a one-room schoolhouse through 8th grade. Thank you.
Yeah.
And just to Teresa, my sister's mother-in-law, Myrcella Pendleton, who used to be Portner, she went to the Pond School, the stucco one. So she's got some good stories about that.
Is she still living?
Yeah, she lives on Lindy Lane. So
So take down next time you're together, or I don't know if you're able to get together because of the pandemic, but write down that oral history if it hasn't already been done.
okay, we'll do.
That's what I always tell people.
Well, thanks a lot, Karen. We really
Oh,
appreciate
you're welcome. My pleasure.
Thank you. It was fascinating.
Okay. Thanks.
Hey, Joe, and remind me to take that notes from my sister's mother-in-law. I've got to remember to talk to her about this.
I certainly will, sir.